In the quiet outskirts of the city, a massive glass mansion stood like a lonely jewel, its walls hiding stories of wealth and whispers of sadness. Richard Hayes, a man whose name was printed in business magazines and whispered in high-class circles, lived there with his 6-year-old twins, Ethan and Emily. From the outside, their lives looked perfect: luxury cars in the driveway, gardens trimmed with military precision, and a pool that shimmered under the sun. But inside, chaos ruled. No nanny had ever lasted more than a week, some fleeing after just a day, their faces pale with exhaustion and frustration. Ethan was clever in the way only troublemakers could be, always plotting tricks that would leave even the most patient caretaker on the verge of tears, while Emily, quieter but no less challenging, had built an invisible wall around herself, refusing to speak to strangers, refusing even to look them in the eyes. When Grace Williams stepped onto the marble porch for her interview, she wasn't sure why she had come. She was a maid by profession, not a nanny, and this was a job that seemed doomed to fail. The door opened to reveal Richard himself, tall, perfectly dressed, his expression sharp yet weary, like a man who had long stopped hoping for good news. He led her inside, the mansion's silence pressing in on her ears, only interrupted by the sound of running feet upstairs. "They're spirited," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of understatement. Grace glanced toward the grand staircase just in time to see a flash of movement, Ethan peeking from the railing with a grin that spelled trouble. Richard explained the situation quickly. The children were smart, stubborn, and used to driving away help. Grace nodded, though inside she felt a twinge of doubt. But as she waited for the twins to come down, she noticed small things others might have missed: finger-painted drawings tucked into the corner of a bookshelf, a single pink hair ribbon on the floor, and the faint sound of a girl's humming, drifting from upstairs. When Ethan and Emily finally appeared, their eyes held a mixture of curiosity and challenge, as if daring her to try and stay. Grace met their gaze with a calm smile, the kind that carried quiet strength instead of forced sweetness. She didn't know what it was, but something about the way the children stood close together, as if protecting each other, tugged at her heart. Richard was still speaking, outlining rules and responsibilities, but Grace was already thinking differently. She wasn't here to control them, she thought. She was here to understand them. And in that moment, though she didn't realize it yet, she had just taken the first step into a job no one had wanted, but one that would change all of their lives forever. Grace's first week inside the Hayes mansion was nothing short of a storm contained within polished marble walls, where every hallway seemed to echo with mischief and unspoken defiance. And each day began with a new battle she had not seen coming. The mornings often started with Ethan's clever traps. Once, she opened the kitchen door to find a tower of cereal boxes rigged to topple onto her head. Another time she discovered her cleaning supplies hidden in the chandelier, and while she could have scolded him, she simply raised an eyebrow, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered, which only seemed to confuse him. Emily was quieter but far more puzzling, slipping away whenever Grace entered the room, her small footsteps barely audible on the thick carpets. And she spoke so little that Grace began to wonder if the girl's voice had been lost somewhere long ago. Yet Grace noticed how Emily would linger just within sight, pretending to read a book or draw, while secretly listening to her hum an old tune from her childhood. Meals were an unspoken war, to Ethan pushing plates away, Emily sitting stiffly until her food went cold, and Richard often absent in his office, leaving Grace alone to face the twin tempests. Yet instead of shouting or giving up like so many before her, she began planting small seeds of trust, slipping folded notes with silly jokes into Ethan's jacket pocket, placing a tiny origami bird on Emily's desk without saying a word, and making sure to leave the door to the kitchen open so they could wander in if they wished. On the third day, she found Ethan hiding behind the sofa with one of her notes in his hand, trying not to smile. And though he quickly masked it with another prank filling her shoes with marbles, she could tell the edge of his defiance was softening. Emily, on the other hand, allowed Grace to place a mug of warm milk on her bedside table at night, even if she didn't drink it, and that small act felt like a door cracking open. Still, the house was unpredictable, with moments of quiet broken by sudden laughter, slamming doors, or the sound of running feet upstairs, and Grace learned to keep her senses sharp, never knowing if the next corner would hold a trap or an opportunity. She began to sense that the twins were not truly trying to drive her away, but rather testing if she would leave like all the others. And though she did not yet know the full story, she was determined to last, no matter how fierce the storms in the hallways became. It was on a gray and rainy afternoon, when the sky pressed low over the mansion, and raindrops streaked down the tall glass windows. That Grace stumbled upon the truth hiding beneath the children's endless mischief. She had been dusting shelves in the library, the air smelling faintly of old paper and lemon polish, when she noticed Emily curled up in the corner of a wide armchair, her head resting against a book she had fallen asleep holding, her tiny frame looking even smaller under the soft yellow light of the lamp. And though Grace moved quietly to cover her with a blanket, a faint whisper caught her Ethan's voice, coming from the hallway just beyond the open door. She froze, careful not to disturb Emily, and listened as Ethan spoke in a hushed tone to his sister, not realizing Grace could hear him, his words stumbling over a memory they had guarded fiercely. "Do you remember her voice?" he asked, and there was a pause before Emily answered, "Only in dreams." Grace felt a cold ache in her chest as Ethan went on, telling Emily he thought about their mother at night, but didn't want to tell anyone because he was afraid they would be told to forget, and Emily's small voice replied that she didn't want to forget, even if it hurt. In that moment, Grace understood the twins' defiance for what it truly was, not cruelty or malice, but the wild and restless grief of children who had lost something irreplaceable and been left without answers. Their pranks and tantrums, nothing more than a shield against the loneliness that had followed them for years. Later, when she passed Ethan in the hallway, she didn't say she had overheard him, but she placed a small packet of hot cocoa mix in his hand and said softly, "For when the rain is too loud." And though he didn't respond, she caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes. That night, as the storm rattled the windows, she stood in the kitchen humming a tune she hadn't sung in years, a lullaby her own mother had taught her, and she noticed a shadow in the doorway, Emily standing there in her pajamas, not speaking, but not running away either. Grace poured warm milk into a mug and set it on the counter, saying nothing, and watched as Emily stepped forward, wrapped her hands around it, and took a small sip. It was the first real moment of peace between them, fragile and unspoken, and Grace knew she had crossed into new territory. But with that came a quiet fear. If she could see the pain in their hearts so clearly, it meant she would have to do more than just keep them occupied. She would have to find a way to help them heal. And that was a task far greater than she had expected when she first walked into this house, where no nanny had lasted. The vast Hayes mansion, once filled only with silence and sharp glances, began to slowly change as Grace took it upon herself to break down the invisible walls that the twins, Ethan and Emily, had built so carefully over the years, knowing that their grief for their mother was still fresh and raw beneath their mischievous acts. She began weaving stories during bedtime tales filled with warmth and hope that painted their mother not as a distant figure lost to time, but as a gentle, loving woman who had watched over them from afar. These stories were carefully crafted, shared in soft tones as the twins lay curled under heavy blankets, their eyes wide but calmer than before. And though Richard Hayes, their father, initially resisted these reminders of a past he had tried to bury deep within himself, Grace could see the cracks forming in his tough exterior as he watched his children slowly open their hearts again. One evening, when Grace was preparing dinner, the twins surprised her by joining her in the kitchen, Ethan carefully chopping vegetables, while Emily measured spices with quiet concentration. The simple act of cooking together sparked laughter and lightness that had been absent for far too long. And Richard, standing in the doorway, felt a swell of emotion rise up as he witnessed the change. Understanding finally that Grace was not just a maid or nanny, but a healer of broken spirits. The night deepened with warmth as the mansion echoed with stories and songs, and Grace realized that by embracing their pain and memories instead of hiding from them, she had begun to mend not just the twins' hearts but her own. And as she tucked them into bed, she promised silently that no matter what storms came next, she would stand with them strong and steady, because the impossible was becoming possible right before her eyes. The walls were coming down, and a new chapter was beginning. Months had passed since Grace first stepped into the Hayes mansion, and the transformation within those glass walls was nothing short of remarkable. Where once chaos reigned, now laughter and calm took its place. The twins, Ethan and Emily, had grown into kinder, happier children, their teachers noticing a change they hadn't seen before, and Richard Hayes himself, once distant and burdened, began to open his heart. The journey had not been easy. There were days of tears and frustration, moments when old wounds seemed too deep to heal, but Grace's quiet strength held steady through it all, becoming the anchor the family desperately needed. And on the morning of her birthday, a day she had never expected to be remembered in such a grand house, Richard and the twins surprised her with a small but meaningful gift, a delicate silver locket containing a faded photograph of their mother, along with a note that read, You gave us back what we thought we lost. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she held the locket close, realizing that she had done the impossible. Not only had she cared for the children with kindness and patience, but she had helped mend a broken family, building a home where once there was only pain, and in doing so, she had found a place where she belonged to. As the sun streamed through the windows and the house filled with warmth, Grace understood that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because the impossible had truly been made possible.